So, thank you for coming to the session today. So, as mentioned, my name is Alyssa. I'm the Senior Information Officer at National Mind, where I help research and write the information that we have on mental health problems for the website. And I'm here today to talk about supporting someone else with a mental health problem while also supporting your own mental health. So my part of this session is only going to be about 20 minutes. I'm going to briefly cover what mental health problems are, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, because you never know. And then we will also look at some general tips on how to support someone with a mental health problem while looking after our own mental health. We're not going to be talking in any specific depth about specific mental health problems for my presentation, but you can raise these in the Q&A section if you would like to. Just some things to keep in mind before we move on for my part of the session. And this is just so that we can keep it all productive and safe and supportive for everyone. So I'll answer questions after I'm finished speaking. Feel free to put them in the chat as I go if you're worried you're going to forget them. But I find it very hard to focus on more than one thing. So I will look at it at the end and also answer any questions verbally at the end as well. Just to clarify, I'm not a medical professional, so I don't have expert knowledge of all mental health problems, and I can't give professional medical advice on questions related to someone's mental health problem or care, but I can signpost out to our information and to other resources if your question isn't something that I can cover. Also, just please keep in mind the details that you share. Really interested to hear some of your questions, but just make sure you're not breaching anyone else's privacy with the details that you give. If you do want to ask a question about someone you care for or someone in your life, just keep their privacy in mind so that we can't identify who they are. And just keep in mind that you may be comfortable sharing certain details, but not everybody is going to be comfortable hearing them. So just kind of like be delicate with what you say if possible. If you do have any questions after this session, please feel free to get in touch with me via email. My email's up there on the screen. And again, after I'm finished speaking, I'll put some links in the chat to some stuff that I've mentioned, including my email address. So I hope that's all okay. I thought I would give a little bit of an introduction to what National Mind do for anybody who doesn't know. So Mind is a mental health charity and our work focuses on England and Wales. Mind is a federation that includes National Mind and our charity shops and local minds. So local minds are independently run and they offer different services depending on where you live. So that could be things like therapy, social support, benefit support, and lots more. National Mind, which is where I am from, provide information on mental health as well as campaign on mental health issues. National Mind also run an online peer support service called Side by Side, as well as an information and legal line for mental health issues. And I'll post those links in the chat at the end. So I also want to make sure we're all on the same page of what mental health problems are. Some of you might already have a really good understanding of this, but just wanted to be extra sure. So at Mind, we think of mental health as how our emotions, thoughts, and interactions with others affect our well-being. Good mental health means being able to generally think, feel, and react in the way that you need and want to live your life. And we all have fluctuations with our mental health, just like we do with our physical health, and that's very normal. But poor mental health becomes a mental health problem when the way we think, feel, or act becomes difficult to cope with and starts to impact our day-to-day life. It might mean that we have difficulty interacting with other people, doing day-to-day chores, or our ability to work. They are real health conditions and they can happen to anybody at any time. Sometimes your mental health problem might last for a short period, or it might be something you need to manage over your whole life. It could go away and come back or get worse at certain times in our lives, again, just like physical health problems. Mental health problems covers a very broad range of diagnoses, symptoms, and experiences, but you also don't need to have a specific diagnosis to get support with your mental health if you are struggling. And it's also worth clarifying what mental health problems aren't. So mental health problems don't include neurodiversity, so such as autism or learning difficulties, or neurological conditions like dementia. But we do know that people who are neurodiverse and people with conditions like dementia often have high rates of mental health problems, particularly depression and anxiety. So if you are supporting with someone with a mental health problem who also has one of these diagnoses or any other physical health condition, it's of course important to understand their whole health and not just the mental health problem in isolation. So now let's move on to how we can actually support someone with mental health problems while looking after ourselves. So as carers, you all have a lot on your plate. It can be very difficult to find time to focus on yourself and figure out what support that you need. So I thought that it would be helpful to dedicate some of this session for a little bit of reflection. This is a completely optional exercise. You don't have to share anything with the group afterwards. You don't have to write anything down if you don't want to. This is totally for your own benefit. Over the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some general tips for supporting someone with a mental health problem. As we go through those tips, it could be helpful to ask yourself some of these questions. Is this something I find hard to do right now or find harder than usual? Is this something I'm finding upsetting to do? And is this the kind of support that I actually need myself? You can write the answers down if you want, or just think about them in your head. And I'm going to return to this slide at the end, just to look at what that might mean for our own support. So just keep those things in mind as we go through the next section. And just to note, because we aren't exploring a specific mental health problem today, the tips that I'm going to talk about in a minute are very broad. They are starting points as to how you should address mental health problems in general, but you should always adapt them to what the person you're supporting needs and wants. I'm also sure that many of these tips may be things you are already doing as a carer and have been told about a million times. That is really great. Even if the presentation goes over old ground for you, I hope that it reassures you that you're on the right track. So let's get started. I think the best place that you can start is to learn about someone's mental health problem. This should include learning about the problem in general, but also about how the person you're supporting experiences that problem and how it uniquely impacts them. It's really hard to support anyone effectively if you don't really understand what's happening to them. And if you hold misconceptions about how a mental health problem affects someone, that can also create barriers. Part of the learning should also include an understanding of what recovery might mean. As I mentioned in our definition, some mental health problems are something we have for our whole life, while some of us might only experience a problem for a very short time. In both cases, the process of recovery or getting to a place where a mental health problem is being well managed, it often really isn't a linear process. Bad days and setbacks can happen, but that doesn't mean that the person you're supporting isn't trying or that they never will feel well. And it also doesn't mean that they failed or that you've failed or that you always go back to square one if there's a setback. Really try and take things as they come. A great way to understand someone's mental health problem and what will help them feel better is to also prioritize listening. So specifically, try and listen without the filter of thinking about what you need to do to fix what they are feeling as a first reaction. Try to focus on validating how they feel, understanding where they're coming from, and reassuring them that it's okay to talk about what they're going through. Sometimes people don't need you to do anything except listen. And if you listen well and ask open, sensitive questions, this gives people the space to tell you about what they might need in terms of support. Some mental health problems can cause us to say things that are difficult to understand or difficult to listen to. For example, that might happen if someone's experiencing a hallucination. Try not to be dismissive of what someone is saying when they're in that sort of situation, because even if you don't understand it, what they are feeling is incredibly real to them. Listening doesn't mean you have to agree with what they're saying or understand it, but it can help you identify what feelings might be behind what they're saying. For example, does it sound like they're angry or frightened or sad? Listening for those sorts of cues can help you figure out the next step in support. Try and understand the other things that could be impacting their mental health. So we all feel worse if things aren't going well in our personal lives, like if you're arguing with a friend or if your car's broken down or if you're having problems with money. Addressing these issues might not make the mental health problem go away completely, but it makes it so much easier to manage if we can reduce the amount of life stresses that someone is experiencing. The more of a struggle it is to live our day-to-day life, the harder it is to be well both physically and mentally. And that goes for everybody. Understanding these things can help give you some practical ways to support someone. For example, you might be able to help them apply for benefits, help sort their mail, or do some laundry. Or there could also be more fun social things going on that they need support with, like maybe they haven't gone out to the cinema in a while and they'd really love someone to go with them to that. You should always make sure that the person you're supporting is comfortable with you doing these extra things. In some cases, they might need this kind of support for a long time, but for others, it might only be a short while. So just always be checking in to make sure it's still what everyone wants. Connected to the previous point, it's often really relevant to be aware of trauma. So many mental health problems can be caused by trauma, and experiencing trauma can make existing mental health problems worse. There are some very obvious mental health problems like post-traumatic stress disorder that are linked to trauma directly, but even experiences like anxiety or hoarding can have a connection to trauma. Even experiences of seeking help for a mental health problem, particularly in hospital, can be traumatic. You don't need to know the specific details of someone's experience to support them, and it often isn't appropriate to ask them to recount details of their trauma, but you can ask them if there are certain situations or people or places that make their mental health problem feel worse. Sometimes working with trauma is going to mean avoiding those things, but sometimes it will mean working with someone to build up the strength to be able to engage with those things. It's really going to depend on what the person needs. I think it's also worth clarifying what trauma means, because it can be a lot of different things. Trauma is defined by how our body reacts and remembers to an event, not the event itself. We have very little control over what our body feels is threatening. And it can be really common to think that only certain situations like war or a car accident can be traumatic, but there's actually no rule about what we find traumatic in our lives. And so it's important to remember that everyone reacts differently to a situation. Just because you don't think something is traumatic, it doesn't mean it wasn't traumatic for someone else, and vice versa. Following on from the previous point, it is important to try not to judge. So a good rule of thumb is to try and remove the word just from your vocabulary. That's a good starting point. So that could be phrases like, why don't you just get out of bed? Or why don't you just calm down? Just is a word that makes it sound like these things should be easy, but many of these things are very, very difficult for someone with a mental health problem to do. So try and understand what makes something difficult for someone rather than assuming that it should be easy. Try not to make assumptions. As highlighted in the first tip, everybody experiences a mental health problem differently. So part of learning about a mental health problem should include learning about how it impacts the person that you're supporting. Don't assume that just because they have a certain diagnosis that they'll always experience certain symptoms or behave a certain way. For example, just because someone is able to interact with people at a party, that doesn't mean that they don't have anxiety. It might just mean that parties aren't the situations that trigger their anxiety, or perhaps they are feeling really, really anxious and they're just doing a good job of hiding it. Or maybe normally they would feel anxious, but today just happens to be a good day, because everybody can have good days, even people with mental health problems. You also shouldn't assume what kind of support someone needs, what will work with them on what will work best, and this might change over time. So make sure you revisit the support set up to make sure that it's still working. And also try not to use assumptions to be nihilistic about someone's behavior or mental health. If you've been supporting someone for a long time and they've been very unwell in the past, it can be very easy to assume that any dip in their mood or a change in their attitude is going to mean that they start becoming unwell again. Sometimes it is going to mean that, but sometimes it's not going to. So try and remember that we all have good and bad days, and try and take things as they come rather than making big assumptions where you can. Connected with the last point is try and find some balance in what you do for someone, what you support them to do, and what they do themselves. Try not to assume that the person you're supporting will always be unable to look after themselves, because even if they always need some level of care, you should try and work towards levels of independence in some areas. It may be that when they are at their worst, they need a lot of support, but that is likely to not be true forever. Encouraging independence can help the person you're supporting, but it also means that you aren't taking on too much support work either. Learn someone's warning signs and triggers. So knowing exactly what makes someone feel worse or the exact signs that they're starting to feel unwell can be very helpful and prevent you from making assumptions about their behavior in general. Talk to the person that you're supporting about the things that they feel are hallmarks of them starting to become unwell. This will be different for every person and for every mental health problem. And some warning signs might build up over a long period of time, whereas some might happen very, very quickly. When it comes to triggers, these might not always be things that can be avoided. Some of them might even be things that the person you're supporting wants to try and overcome. But knowing what the triggers are can help you be prepared. You might also want to learn some calming and de-escalating techniques to help you manage the triggers when they happen. That can be really helpful as well. Warning signs and triggers should also not be things that you come up with or observe on your own. Even if you've supported someone for a very long time, you could still be making assumptions about what certain things mean to them. So just try and talk to the person you're supporting to understand these things better together. Creating a safety or a crisis plan. So this might not always be needed, but if the person you're supporting has times when their mental health puts them at risk to themselves, it can be helpful to be prepared. As with our other tips, this should be something that is developed with the person you're supporting, as it's really important for them to agree on what would make them feel safe in that sort of a situation. There are templates online for these sorts of plans, and your local NHS or GP might also have templates that they use for this sort of thing. Things to consider in a crisis plan could be phone numbers of who to call in certain situations, trigger warnings or signs, and having items on hand that help manage feelings and focus. That could be things like fidget toys or a playlist of their favorite music. Those sorts of things likely aren't going to prevent a crisis, but they can provide some familiarity and a little bit of calm in a crisis situation, which can be really helpful. A crisis or a safety plan is also helpful if the person you're supporting sometimes lacks insight into their own mental health. So some mental health problems can include not feeling that you're actually unwell, and discussing what sorts of measures you both agree are best to take if the person you're supporting feels that way can reassure you of what you're doing and make it easier to explain to the person you are supporting why you are doing that. Support them to seek help. I have come to this point towards the end of the list because while it seems very, very obvious, there is a lot of complexity around seeking help for a mental health problem. It is really important to understand a lot of the other points that I've gone through before jumping to this step. Being able to listen, being non-judgmental, being aware of trauma, and knowing someone's warning signs or triggers are all really important things that will help you understand the kind of help that they need. It can be very hard for people to open up about their mental health to professionals. And even when they do, I think we all know that there's very big inadequacies in the mental health service at the moment that mean that they may need to wait a long time for treatment. In some cases, there may just be no treatment available unless you can afford to pay for it privately. The person that you're supporting may have also had a bad experience with treatment in the past. That doesn't mean you shouldn't encourage them to seek help, but you should take the time to understand the help they need, understand what help is available, and help them address any barriers that exist to getting them that help. If the person that you're supporting doesn't want help, that can be very difficult. You should try not to force them or judge them for that, because there are a lot of ways you can gently encourage them or at least show them that you're there for them. You can work with them on understanding why they don't want to seek help, and those issues might be something that you could support with, such as if they would like someone to come with them to appointments. And having a crisis or safety plan in place can help you both agree on what point help is necessary to keep everyone safe and well. Support, particularly when someone isn't in a crisis, also doesn't always have to be medical. Peer support organisations, either online or in person, can be really helpful, and charities and community groups could also provide well-being activities that can be really essential for people's mental health. And if you're supporting someone who has had a bad experience of seeking help from the NHS or another health provider, you can also support them to complain about that. Being an advocate for their needs can be an essential part of getting them the help they need, as often people with mental health problems struggle to speak up for what they want or speak up when they're treated poorly. Finally, don't just talk about mental health. It can be really common in caring situations for the dynamic between you and the person you're supporting to be one just focused on their health, but that can be draining for both of you and make it less enjoyable to spend time with each other. It can be very, very hard, but try not to make your whole relationship about the mental health problem. Try and make time for social activities, catching up about day-to-day things like TV shows, or maybe even make space for them to do something for you every now and then. So, with all of those things said, let's finish up by returning to the reflection exercise. You don't have to share your responses to the questions, but have a think about how the responses made you feel. Do you feel like you're struggling with some of these things more than you realized? Have these things gotten easier or maybe harder over time? Have you realized that maybe you need some of this kind of support as well, and not just the person you're supporting? If the answer is yes, that could be a sign that you need to take some time for yourself and maybe seek your own support for your mental health. Caring is a very difficult, demanding, and often thankless role, which I'm sure you all know, and it can feel like it's totally normal to struggle and feel down all of the time. But that doesn't mean you don't deserve help and support. For example, it is also totally normal to break a bone if you accidentally slipped and fell off a roof. But that doesn't mean that we expect you to bandage it up and recover on your own. So just because it's very common to feel a certain way in certain circumstances, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be supported through that. And you also can't support someone effectively if you aren't looking after yourself. Just as the person you're supporting is more than their mental health problem, you are more than their carer. And it is okay for you to have boundaries and to need space, but no one can respect your boundaries if they don't know what they are, and no one can give you space if you don't ask for it. The Mind website has some information on self-care and how you can reach out for support if you need it, and I will link to that in a second. So that's the end of my bits. I hope that you found it useful. Like I said, I know that I might be going over old ground for many of you, but even if you're already doing all of those things, I hope it was a helpful reminder that you are on the right track.